There is a particular kind of silence that lives in apartments, not the silence of forests or libraries. Those silences have texture. They hold life inside them, leaves moving, floorboard settling, someone turning a page 3 rooms away. The silence I mean is flatter than that. It is the silence of 4 walls that have learned to expect nothing from you. The silence of a refrigerator hum, distant traffic, and the quiet certainty that no one is going to knock on your door tonight. That was the silence I grew up inside. Not dramatically. Not with the crashing force of tragedy. Just slowly, the way water fills a basement. So gradually, you barely notice until one day you are standing in it up to your knees. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is the version of me that existed before I understood myself. The version that wore whatever was handed to them, smiled on cue, worked through exhaustion, and came home each night to that apartment silence and sat inside it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For a long time, I thought it was. I thought everyone carried the same particular hollowness. I thought the numbness I moved through my days with was just adulthood, just life, just the price of growing up. I had no reason to think otherwise. No one had ever told me that a life could be orderly and functional and still be missing something essential. No one had ever suggested that you could go years performing competence while quietly losing contact with yourself. I want to go back to the beginning of what I now think of as the gentle transformation. Not because it began with some dramatic event. Not because there was a single moment that changed everything. But because understanding where it began is the only way to understand why it mattered so much. I was 23 years old, living in a small rented room in a city that did not know my name. I had moved there for work, one of those corporate jobs that promises structure and delivers monotony. I wore the same kind of clothes every day, dark trousers, plain shirts, shoes selected for durability rather than beauty. I had been taught, in 100 small ways, that appearance was vanity, practicality was virtue, and softness was weakness. I had absorbed those lessons so thoroughly that for years they felt less like beliefs than facts. And yet there was something in me that had been alive for a very long time. Something quiet, patient, and old. I don't know when it first began. Maybe it had always been there, the way certain roots spread underground for years before anything breaks the surface. What I know is that it made itself known to me one Tuesday evening in November. The city outside was gray and cold. I was standing in the bathroom of that small rented room, looking at myself in the mirror. I had been standing there for a while, not looking at my face exactly, looking past it, somehow, at the shape of the person behind the face. The person who lived behind the practical clothes and the corporate smile. And something in me said, very quietly, without urgency, "This is not all of you." I did nothing with that thought that night. I turned off the bathroom light. I went to bed. I got up the next morning, dressed for work, and went about my life. But the thought remained. Not loudly. Not insistently. Just steadily, the way important things remain. A seed in soil. A low light left burning in another room. The weeks that followed were ordinary, by every external measure. I worked. I commuted. I ate meals alone. I watched television I didn't care about. I slept. Nothing visible changed. But internally something had shifted. Some process had begun that I could not yet name and did not try to. I only knew that I had begun noticing things I had never really noticed before. The emotional effect of color, the intelligence of texture, the way certain fabrics seemed to carry a quality of gentleness inside them. Soft cotton, smooth silk. Materials I had never worn, never allowed myself to want. They seemed to offer something I had been missing without knowing it. Permission. Permission to be softer. Permission to inhabit my own life with less hardness. I want to be careful here because I am not trying to describe something sensational. I am trying to describe something true. And the truth is that what I was beginning to feel was not dramatic or rebellious. If anything, it was deeply quiet. It felt less like discovering something new than like moving back towards something I had once abandoned. Once I began approaching it, it did not feel foreign. It felt familiar in a way I could not explain. The first thing I bought was a small bottle of lavender hand cream. That sounds impossibly modest, I know. But at the time it felt significant. Hand cream belonged, in the world I had been raised inside, to a different category of person. Not mine. I had spent years using whatever soap happened to be there and thinking nothing of it. But one evening in November, standing in a pharmacy aisle under harsh fluorescent lights, I picked up that bottle and thought, simply, I want this. Not because it was necessary, not because it would solve anything, just because I wanted it. I bought it. I brought it home. That night, after washing my hands, I used it and sat very still for a moment, aware that something had shifted. Not a transformation. Not yet. Just a small opening. A window cracked in a room that had been sealed for a long time. This is where the story begins. Not with declarations. Not with dramatic reinvention. With lavender hand cream on a Tuesday night in November and one person sitting alone in a small room, discovering very quietly that gentleness was not something that belonged to other people. It was something I had simply never allowed myself. The weeks that followed built slowly on that first small act. I began paying attention to myself in ways I never had before. I began to notice what felt good and what felt like performance. I began, for the first time in my adult life, to ask myself questions that had no practical purpose. What color makes me feel calm? What texture makes me feel safe? What version of getting ready in the morning feels like care rather than obligation? These questions seem simple. They are not. For someone who has spent years moving through the world, as if their interior experience were irrelevant, as if the self existed only to function, they are revolutionary. Not loudly, not publicly, but deeply, in the way that structural changes are deep, slow, mostly invisible from the outside, and absolute once they take hold. By December, my bathroom shelf had acquired a few new things: the hand cream, a gentle face wash that smelled clean and faintly floral, a moisturizer. These were small things, practical things even. But the act of choosing them, of choosing according to what felt good rather than what was cheapest, most invisible, or most acceptable, was teaching me something. Each day, in that small bathroom, I was practicing the idea that I deserved care. That caring for myself was not indulgence. That my interior life mattered. I did not know then that I was building something. I thought I was just buying hand cream. That winter, the city itself seemed to mirror the inwardness of what was happening. Urban winter has always felt to me both oppressive and clarifying. The stripped trees, the flat light, the way cold makes everything honest. No one lingers outside in winter. No one pretends for long that they want to be somewhere they do not. People move with purpose. And in the rooms they return to at night, they are most themselves. I was most myself that winter between 6 and 9 in the evening. Work ended at 5:30. The commute took 40 minutes. By 6:15 I was back in my room, and those next few hours belonged to me in a way that the rest of the day did not. No public version of myself was required there. No socially approved posture. No professionally appropriate tone. Just the four walls, the refrigerator hum, and the choice of who to be when no one was watching. At first I did very little with that freedom. I ate. I scrolled. I watched things on a screen. I went to bed early because sleep was the easiest way to pass through time that felt empty. But slowly, the evenings began to change. It started with routine. If morning was obligation, get up, get dressed, get out, then evening could become something else. Evening could become care. I began taking longer in the bathroom, not anxiously, but deliberately. I washed my face carefully. I used the moisturizer. I paid attention to my hands. These acts sound trivial in isolation, but taken together, they were building something I had never had before, a ritual of self-regard, a daily practice of saying, through action rather than language, you are worth tending to. It was during this period that I began to think seriously about clothing. Up to that point, my relationship to clothes had been almost entirely functional. I wore what was expected, what was neutral, what passed through the world without friction. My wardrobe communicated nothing about an interior life because I had not yet understood that an interior life was something worth communicating, even privately. But that winter I started noticing the clothes of other people differently. Not with envy exactly, but with recognition. I began to notice softness. The way certain garments draped rather than structured. The way some fabrics seemed not merely to cover the body but to care for it. And I had a thought whose simplicity startled me. I would like to feel that. Not to be seen in it. Not to make a statement. Not to transform myself publicly. Just to feel it against my skin. The first piece I bought was a long soft knit cardigan, the color of warm sand. I ordered it online, which meant I did not have to explain it to anyone. It arrived on a Thursday. I remember opening the package with a feeling that was half nervousness, half relief. Two emotions that often travel together when something true is finally approaching the surface. I put it on that evening and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. What I saw there was not a different person. It was the same person, but with something revealed. Some quality of softness that practical clothes had always concealed. I wore that cardigan for the rest of the evening. I made dinner in it. I sat by the window in it. I read in it. And something about that ordinary night felt different from the ones before it. Less lonely. Less like performing a life and more like living one. I want to be precise about this because precision matters. I was not in crisis. I was not experiencing a dramatic rupture. What I was feeling was subtler than that. It was the slow recognition of a self that had been waiting very patiently for permission to exist. The understanding that the version of me the world saw was not false exactly, but incomplete. The cardigan was not a costume. It was a key. And the room it opened was not frightening. It was warm and quiet and, surprising as this sounds, felt like home. Over the following months, I expanded this private vocabulary slowly and carefully. I added soft things to my evening life. Pale gray sleepwear, cotton loungewear in muted colors, a robe. Things that were, at their core, about comfort, gentleness, and private care. The kind of clothing that says, without words, you deserve softness. I did not wear these things publicly. That was not the point. The point was the private hours. The point was that for the first time in my adult life, I was building a relationship with myself. I was treating myself as someone worth knowing, worth dressing, worth caring for with intention. And in those private hours, something else was happening too. Something slower and deeper. I was beginning to understand what I was doing in larger terms. Not just self-care, though it was that. Not just pleasure, though it was that too. I was practicing a philosophy. What I would later come to call the gentle transformation. At its core, that philosophy was simple. Gentleness is not weakness. Softness is not surrender. Caring for the self, all dimensions of the self, including the ones that do not fit neatly inside the categories you were handed, is not indulgence. It is survival. It is how you remain whole in a world that is always, in 1,000 quiet ways, asking you to become less. I was 23 years old, in a small room in a gray city, learning how to remain whole. By spring, my private rituals had become established. The skincare routine had settled into sequence. Cleanser, toner, moisturizer, something for the under-eye area I had read about and decided to try. My small wardrobe of soft evening clothes had become a real collection. I had learned what I liked. Clean lines, muted colors, fabrics with a quality of serenity. And I had begun to read differently. What I read in those evenings was a kind of research, though not in any formal sense. I was reading about femininity, about self-expression, about the ways people build lives that are more truthful than the ones they were handed. I was reading toward myself, though I would not have phrased it that way then. Somewhere in that reading, I became interested in the language of hormones, specifically estrogen, not as a dramatic declaration, not as part of any formal medical path, but as an idea that had become personally meaningful to me. I want to be careful and honest here. I am not offering guidance, and I would not recommend repeating what I did. I am only telling the truth about my own story. At one point, alone, and without professional supervision, I tried a legal over-the-counter supplement marketed for hormonal balance. What mattered in retrospect was not its biological effect, which was subtle at best and perhaps mostly imagined, but what the act of taking it meant to me. I began on a Monday morning in April and kept a journal during that period. Reading it now, what strikes me is how undramatic it was. First week, I do not feel different. I do not know what I expected. Second week, sleeping more deeply. Skin feels slightly different. Maybe psychosomatic. I am more patient with myself in the morning. Third week. Something emotional is shifting. Not more emotional exactly. More present with emotion. Less inclined to hurry past it. By the fourth week, I understood that the supplement mattered to me less for any physiological reason than for the ritual it had created. Each morning, with my first glass of water, I was performing a small act of intention. I was saying, I am paying attention to you. I am taking care of you. You matter enough for this daily gesture. That, more than anything, was what the gentle transformation was becoming. A daily act of witness. Not transformation as dramatic event, but transformation as sustained attention. The understanding that who you become is the accumulated result of what you practice every day, what you allow yourself to feel, how you treat yourself in private, what relationship you build with your own interior life. By then my evenings had changed again. I had begun dressing with more intention, not just in soft private clothes, but as part of a fuller ritual. I had taught myself, through patience and tutorials and trial and error, a light hand with skincare and a few cosmetic items. Nothing theatrical. Nothing that required explanation. Just the quiet pleasure of learning to enhance what was already there. Moisture on the lips. A little attention around the eyes. Something that made my skin look more even. Small things. Things I did only for myself and washed away before sleep. And in those evenings, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in soft light, with the apartment quiet around me, I began to feel something I had not felt in a very long time, perhaps ever. I felt seen. Not by anyone else. There was no one else. I felt seen by myself. The person in the mirror was not performing. They were not managing anyone's expectations. They were not negotiating with the world. They were simply present. And what I felt looking back at them was recognition. The warmth of finding something you had not known was lost. I need to talk about loneliness here because it is central to the story, and it is not simple. My loneliness was never the absence of people. I was around people all day. It was the absence of being known. The exhaustion of performing a version of myself constantly and never arriving at the self underneath. It was the loneliness of polish. The loneliness of someone competent enough to function and disconnected enough to disappear inside that competence. What the evenings gave me was not company in the usual sense. They gave me intimacy with myself. And that changed the loneliness. Not all at once. Not completely. But measurably. Like air entering a room that has been sealed too long. I did not continue the supplement experiment indefinitely. I stopped eventually with a sense that I had learned what I needed to learn. Not about hormones, really. About intention. About ritual. About the strange power of repeating, each day, a gesture that says, I am worth attending to. By then, I was moving toward 25. I had a private wardrobe, an evening practice, and a relationship with my own reflection that I had never had before. I also had the beginnings of a philosophy. The world outside my apartment still knew only the public version of me. Competent, contained, professionally appropriate. And it had expectations for that version that had nothing to do with gentleness. My 24th year was, professionally, the hardest I had yet lived. There was a new manager fluent in pressure. There were deadlines, metrics, performance reviews. There were colleagues who had mastered the sharpness certain work environments reward until it becomes the air everyone breathes. There were long days and longer commutes and evenings when I was too tired almost even for the rituals I had built. But this is the thing about rituals grounded in genuine need. They sustain you most when you are least inclined to begin them. On the worst days, the days of public performance and private erosion, the days when the distance between who I had to be and who I was becoming felt almost physical, I would come home and begin the routine anyway. Cleanser, toner, moisturizer, soft clothes, something warm to drink, a chair by the window. And in the doing of those small things, some restoration would happen. Not magic, not complete healing, just enough. Enough to remember that the performing self was not the only self. Enough to remember that there was another self waiting in the evenings, and that self was real. This is what I mean when I talk about survival. Not survival in the dramatic sense. I was not in danger. I mean survival in the quieter sense, the daily work of remaining whole in conditions that tend toward fragmentation. The world fragments people in very specific ways. It asks for efficiency, competitiveness, emotional minimalism, practicality, usefulness. These are not evil demands. They are simply the demands of the world as it is currently organized. But they carry a cost. And the cost is everything that does not fit neatly inside them: sensitivity, softness, beauty, interiority, the need for private expression. The gentle transformation became my way of paying that cost without losing myself entirely. Each evening I was doing something the world would not do for me. I was tending the interior. I was giving permission to the full range of what I was, not just the range that was publicly useful. By then, even my private wardrobe had developed its own emotional logic. I had enough clothes to notice that I chose them according to what I needed. On high-pressure days, I reached for the softest things, the oversized knit, the warmest robe, as if my body knew it needed to be held. On gray, emotionally flat days, I sometimes chose something more deliberate, something that felt like self-presentation rather than pure comfort. On days when I had felt invisible in a way that mattered, I spent more time at the mirror, more intentional with my face and posture, as if offering myself the visibility the world had withheld. I want to say this clearly. The bathroom mirror in those years was not a site of self-criticism. It became the opposite. It was where I practiced being seen, where I learned to look at myself without assessment, where I began, patiently, to meet my own face and think, yes, there you are. I see you. That practice sounds simple. It is not. To see yourself without judgment, without comparison, without the echo of other people's expectations, that is a skill. And like any skill, it requires repetition. I learned it in the evenings, alone in that bathroom. It changed me in ways nothing else could have. There was a night in October, about 6 months before my 27th birthday, that I still think about. Nothing happened externally. No call came. No conversation took place. But inwardly, it marked the end of something and the beginning of something else. I had had a difficult week. Not disastrous. Just the ordinary kind of difficult that leaves you intact on paper and hollow in practice. The kind where everything functions and nothing feels good. Where the self beneath the performance is simply tired. I came home on a Thursday and moved through the routine more slowly than usual. I put on the softest things I owned. I made tea. I sat by the window and looked out at the city in the October dark. And I thought, what are you doing? What is this for? How long are you going to live inside this gap? These were not new questions, but that night they felt different. Less accusatory. More honest. As if they were being asked not by an internal critic, but by someone who actually wanted to know. I sat with them for a long time. And what I understood, gradually, was this. The gap is not a problem to be solved. The gap is the map. The distance between my public self and my private self was not evidence of failure. It was the territory I had been learning to navigate. The practice I had built was not preparation for some final version of myself. It was not rehearsal. It was not a waiting room for a future life in which everything would suddenly become clear. It was the life. The practice was the point. The daily acts of witness and care were not leading somewhere else. They were themselves the destination. That realization changed the emotional structure of everything that came after. I had spent years waiting, without quite realizing I was waiting, for some endpoint, for a version of myself that would feel complete, settled, publicly legible. That night I understood there would be no single arrival. Only the ongoing relationship with myself. Only the continued practice of attending, noticing, allowing. And strangely, that understanding brought peace. Not happiness. Happiness is momentary.
Peace is steadier than that.
It was the peace of someone who has reached a real resting place after a long journey. Not the end of the road, but a place where the ground is solid and the view is clear. I am writing this now from a life significantly removed from that small rented room and its early silence. The city is the same. The neighborhood is the same. The apartment is larger now, but the windows still look out over rooftops and that particular urban sky. What has changed most is not geography. It is the relationship I have with myself. The gentle transformation did not turn me from one thing into another. It changed the terms on which I existed. It transformed what had been performance into something increasingly genuine. It converted the gap between public self and private self from a source of loneliness into a space of privacy. And privacy, I learned, is not the same as secrecy. Privacy is the right of an interior life to exist on its own terms without explanation.
My evenings still look much the same.
The rituals remain. The soft wardrobe remains, more considered now, more fully mine. The bathroom mirror still serves the same purpose it once did. And the person I see there is, I can say this now with real ease, someone I recognize and like. That is not a small thing. There is an ease in my own skin now that did not exist then. Not perfection. Not completion. No one is finished. But ease. A settledness that comes from years of deliberate acquaintance with yourself. The self I bring to the world is less performance now because the self behind it is no longer unknown to me. The gap has not disappeared entirely. I do not live in a world where every interior truth can be expressed freely in every setting. But the gap has changed. It is no longer a wound. It is simply part of the architecture of a life. Understood, accepted, lived within peace. And the loneliness, though it has not vanished, is no longer the loneliness of not knowing myself. That loneliness is gone. I know myself now with the particular intimacy that only years of patient practice can build. The self I return to in the evenings is a self I trust, a self I respect, increasingly a self I enjoy. The bathroom mirror no longer shows me a stranger or a role. It shows me someone soft and strong and not entirely categorizable. Someone who uses lavender hand cream. Someone who chooses gentleness on purpose. Someone who has learned, slowly, to look at their own face with something approaching love. That is what the gentle transformation means to me now. It is the daily practice of becoming more fully yourself. Not through spectacle, not through declaration, but through the accumulation of small, consistent acts of self-regard. Through learning the language of your own interior. Through honoring needs that have no public prestige. Through understanding that the self you build in quiet hours, in soft light, in the absence of any gaze but your own, is not less real than the self you carry into the world. It is more real. It is the ground floor. Everything else is built on it. I am grateful for the small room and its silence. I am grateful for the lavender hand cream and the window it opened. I am grateful for every evening of practice, every private ritual, every moment in front of the mirror when I chose attention over avoidance. I am grateful for every soft garment selected for no reason except that it felt true. Most of all, I am grateful for the patience, for the willingness to build a life slowly, without certainty of destination, for learning that transformation does not always announce itself. Sometimes it happens quietly, beneath the level of spectacle, through repetition, through care, through the almost invisible work of allowing yourself to exist. It was always happening. It has not stopped. And the person who stands now at the bathroom mirror on an ordinary evening, in a city that still does not know their name, and looks at their reflection with recognition, ease, and something very close to peace. That person is real. That person was always real. They were only waiting, quietly, for permission to exist. And the permission, in the end, was always yours to give.